Much for that. Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to give a lecture for this, the Newman Centre for the Study of Religions public lecture series. So I will just share my screen there. Hopefully,
yeah, we can see that. Thank you. Perfect.
Right. And can you hear me okay? Is it?
Yeah, it's perfect.
So in this lecture, I will provide an overview of the role of built heritage, specifically megalithic monuments, in the ideological and symbolic framework of contemporary Irish pagan worldview. The Irish landscape and what for pagans are sacred sites upon it, including megalithic monuments, ancient sites of pagan kings, oak groves associated with druids, holy wells and other sites on the landscape, as well as topographical features. These all play a key part in the worldview and practices of modern witches and druids. The land is conceptualized in a characteristically holistic way, resting on the fundamental notion that a spiritual energy infuses all things. Ancient structures, archaeological remains, and natural features like rivers, rocks, and trees form the loci for ritual practices. My research data is drawn from longitudinal ethnographic research into the worldview and ritual practices of members of the Irish pagan community, and I examine practitioners' engagement with traditional culture, history, and folklore resources, and in particular with the notion of Celtic spirituality and European ancestral religions. So my background, my academic background was in the study of folklore. My PhD, when I first started researching paganism, was in folklore and ethnology. And then I taught in a folklore department for over a decade before I moved into study of religions. So I'm quite interested in the categories of religion and folklore and mythology themselves, as well as different academic approaches. So I'm quite interested in how a new religious movement like paganism uses resources, cultural resources like mythology and folklore. So I will come back to that a bit later. So in this lecture, I will first tell you a little bit about paganism for the unfamiliar, and then I will give an overview of magical practice in contemporary paganism, and then I will tell you how megalithic monuments in particular fit into this magical, holistic way of understanding the landscape and the environment. So for some reason, my images aren't coming through on the PowerPoint, but that's okay. So contemporary paganism is an umbrella term for a variety of religious and cultural ideas and practices that are also described by some scholars as modern animism, magical religions, nature religion, or earth-based spirituality. While some practitioners use pagans generically as a religious self-identification, others identify with different types or paths of paganism. These include witchcraft, druidry, heathenism, and shamanism. In my research so far, I have included the most prevalent types of contemporary paganism in Ireland, which are druidry and different forms of pagan witchcraft, including Wicca. I also include in my research those who self-identify as pagans generically. I will just stop sharing and try to share again to see if I can
Yeah,
Let's try
that
once more. If it doesn't work this time, I'll just leave it. But
it's often the case, yeah, that the first time it doesn't like the slides or something.
I will just try and open it here again. Contemporary paganism, and I chose the ones that are most visible in Ireland. So, as well as people who don't follow a particular path, or path as they're known in paganism, the type of paganism. So I also include people who identify as pagans. So not everybody follows a particular type of paganism. So though there is much diversity within modern paganism, I will refer in this paper to the Irish pagan community as a collective. John P. Block, in his book, New Spirituality, Self and Belonging, how New Agers and Neo-Pagans talk about themselves, makes the point that, quote, however loosely structured these clusters of individuals are, and however diverse the beliefs from one individual to the next, they consider themselves to be a community, end quote. Similarly, I have found that followers of different forms of paganism in the Irish milieu use the term community self-referentially. As marginalized religious traditions consisting of relatively small networks of people, coupled with the fact that Ireland is a small country, it may be that many pagan practitioners in this context know one another or know of one another, and there are also people known as public pagans who do interviews with the media and so on. So there may be a strong sense of community in Ireland for that reason. So to tell you about pagans and magical practices, in reference to the title of my lecture, Contemporary Paganism, Magic and Megaliths, I will first explain what is meant by magic in this context. The phrase magical worldview is used to signify symbolic systems that contain beliefs in magic and otherworldly forces or entities. How magic is understood in contemporary pagan discourse must be distinguished from what is typically by magic in the anthropological and folkloristic literature, especially of the past, looking at indigenous cultures and traditional religions. There have been specific definitions and approaches to the study of magic that aren't always appropriate for the study of a new religious movement in the Western context. So we should also distinguish popular understandings of magic as being akin to enchantment from the pagan understanding of magic. Magical worldview is given expression through ritual practices or magical workings, which is an emic term. So doing a magical working might mean doing a ritual, casting a spell. Work is a technical term in contemporary pagan discourse to mean ritual or spells, and as Professor James Lewis notes in Witchcraft Today, an encyclopedia of Wiccan and Neo-Pagan traditions, use of the term perform in these circumstances is avoided, since it implies that a ritual is mere theatrics. End quote. Furthermore, pagan practitioners distinguish ritual magic from conjuring acts, magic tricks, and showmanship by using the term magic spelled with a K. As Brandon Harwood describes in his article, Beyond Poetry and Magic, the core elements of Wiccan morality, the Wiccan literature, he says, refers to magic with a K as the mystical raising of energy for a purpose. The term magic, without the K, meaning sleight of hand or tricks performed on stage. So I will come back to what Harwood described as the mystical raising of energy. I will come back to the idea of energy in a moment. Magic is at the core of contemporary pagan cultural expression, whether it is expressly part of a practitioner's belief system or alluded to more subtly in art, ritual, or discourse. The elucidation of magical conceptions varies greatly between individuals, and there are also many different notions of the otherworldly realms where magical beings are believed to reside. Particularized definitions of magic abound in contemporary pagan discourse, and an exact consensus on the definition is not possible, whether inside of paganism or without it. It is important to note that the classification of magic found in classical ethnological literature, as I mentioned earlier, are not so useful when analysing contemporary pagan magical practices, since the contexts in which they are culturally, geographically, and temporally separate from the modern day movement of Neo-Paganism or contemporary paganism. As Shan Reid states in her article titled As I Do Will, So Mote It Be, Magic as Metaphor in Neo-Pagan Witchcraft, she says, magic, as it is practiced in the context of Neo-Pagan witchcraft, has little in common with what most sociologists and anthropologists describe as magic. It is not an exchange commodity. It does not foster client relationships. Magic is not performed on a commission basis for money or bartered goods. The performance of a spell, especially if done for another person, confers no necessary benefit on the magical practitioner other than satisfaction and possibly enhanced prestige, end quote. To understand contemporary pagan magical worldview, it must be examined in the framework of the wider pagan meaning system. An individual's perception of reality may be guided by magical worldview such that certain events may be interpreted as having mystical or supernatural foundations. At the same time, magical worldview shapes one's attitude to the world and stimulates action to deal with the world by employing techniques that ostensibly allow interaction with mystical or otherworldly forces. An ethnographic approach necessitates an understanding of contemporary pagan concepts of magic, as well as their comprehension of their magical experiences. So we are hearing quite a lot in the media at the moment. You know, I've noticed in newspaper articles that journalists are saying magical thinking, but they mean something different, and are usually using magical thinking to mean superstition, you know, in quite a dismissive way. So magical worldview for pagans, this is it's core to understanding the pagan perspective in understanding how they see the world. In her discussion of ethnographic interpretation of spiritual experience, Jenny Blaine makes the point. She says, if we put the experience down to invention, we immediately declare ourselves on the side of the rationalists, and by so doing, limit the analytical possibilities open to us and the ways we can understand how informants and practitioners of alternative spiritualities interact with their world. End quote. I was referring to newspaper articles about COVID, about some responses to the pandemic and restrictions. So Jenny Blaine's point is an important one, as the academic interpretation and analytical presentation of magical worldview is fundamentally influenced by the ethnographic translation. So as scholars who do field research, it's very, the translation of our, the writing up of our data is going to shape our presentation of the data one way or the other. So it's very important to be mindful of that. How the researcher is a filter. So the conception of magic in pagan worldview relates to the broader cosmology and underlying beliefs about the world, especially holistic understandings of interrelatedness of life force and energies. As Professor Sabina Magliocco discusses in her article, Reclamation, Appropriation, and the Ecstatic Imagination in Modern Pagan Ritual, she says, magic is the organizational principle underlying the cosmos, which is shared by most adherents of contemporary paganism. Many adherents see the universe as interconnected, held together by a series of principles and rhythms that regulate time and space, growth and decline, and that allow otherwise disparate objects to influence one another. A key concept underlying this web is energy. And as Sabina Magliocco notes there about energy, I'll also come back to that concept of magic or spiritual life force as being an energy in the world, or different interconnected energies. There seems to be an implicit notion within contemporary pagan discourse that magic is tantamount to energy. Often, pagans talk about magical energy, or a different kind of energy, so that there are lots of different energies being conceptualized. In answer to the question, when I was doing interviews, I would ask the question, do you believe in magic? Without getting into debates about belief. Many interviewees responded in ways that reflected a belief that magic has unequivocal effects in everyday life. One of my interviewees said, "I feel that magic is real. I feel that it is a force and an energy, and there is so much that it can't be explained that definitely works." This informant, Ben, who is a witch, went on to explain that magic is a natural force that one can attune oneself to. He says that he gives works on this idea under the heading of something he says that I call instinctive craft, which is about enhancing personal intuition and instinct in magic, which is about accepting that magic is a force of nature, and as such, by reaching out with one's will, so the magical will, I will come back to that as well. He says one attunes oneself to it. It's as if you take two musical notes and the two harmonize, and that harmony is what you get when you actually reach out and touch it. I don't know, he says, if that's a particularly good description, but that's how it seems. So, end quote. There are those who feel that magic equates to spiritual essences, to the energies found in the earth, in plants and other life forms, including humans. Thinking magical practice is whereby an individual regulates their life in accordance with the energies in the environment. There is much emphasis placed in pagan discourse on working magically with the energies of the natural landscape, also with the seasons and other cycles of life, and with spirits of place, whether that is understood as deities or fairies or other beings, or earth energies. In concurrence with this view, Karen, a druid, holds that working magic involves tuning into the energy patterns around you. She says, I think it's a very useful tool, a very dangerous one as well, because it's very effective. To me, it's just like swimming with the tide. If you wanted to swim somewhere fast, you'd swim the way the tide was going or the way the current was running and not against it. So magic to me is just knowing where the currents of energy are around you, knowing what the seasons are doing and the spirit of place, what that is like, and using that to help you get what you want. So it's working with an energy that's already there rather than manipulating it. So end quote. Some practitioners, however, feel that the effectiveness of a ritual is the result of manipulating these energies. So in an interview, I asked Sarah, who's a witch, I asked her, do you think that doing a ritual is manipulating magic? She says, it's manipulating energy, which makes magic. Magic isn't just around. Magic is gathering the energies from whatever you use, be that the power of the Lord and Lady, which is a reference to the god and goddess in Wicca, be that herbs, candles, whatever, be that your own mind and positive thinking on the part of whoever you do the ritual for, and concentrating it for a particular purpose. That's the magic. End quote. So some feel that magic is the manner by which the divine works through the practitioner. So just to mention that the numinous or the divine is conceptualized in many different ways in contemporary paganism. So some pagans believe in a god and a goddess, and that different deities are manifestations of a divine feminine and divine masculine force. Others believe in independently existing deities, so that the myth, the pantheons of mythology are literally existing independent beings, and others again see the deities as symbols, as archetypes, as representing cosmic forces. So there's quite a diversity within contemporary paganism, and that's for different reasons, but largely due to there being no dogma. So there isn't any doctrine in the way that there would be for the Abrahamic faiths. So in that way, it's quite free form. People believe what they want and interpret things the way that they want, and also the rituals are quite most practitioners in the types of paganism that I research, they devise their own rituals based on a structure. It's quite a creative process. So as I was saying, some feel that magic is the manner by which the divine works through the practitioner. And I asked the person, did she feel that ritual was a way of manipulating magic? And Alice, who's a witch, responded, it is a way of manipulating. It's a way of getting the unconscious mind to forget about all the worries and stress of the day and put yourself through. It is the divine working through you. It is not you that makes it happen. It is the divine that makes it happen, but it uses you as a channel, as a medium to make it work. End quote. Another interviewee viewed magic as an energy that science has not yet developed the technology to measure. She says, I think it's a kind of natural force in the world, just as much as any other, just as much as air and heat and light and everything. She says, I don't actually see it as being particularly magical, if you see what I mean. I think there's probably a scientific explanation behind it. We just don't know what it is yet. You know, there's talk about the fifth element, the ether, and I think it's there. I don't think it's anything kind of hippified, and she laughs. I think it's there because we don't have the scientific means to be able to measure it or perceive it. Like generally, we can't perceive electricity either, unless it's actually affecting something, but that doesn't mean it's not there. So end quote. So this fifth element or ether that she mentions, Mary, is found in Hindu cosmology and the conception of the 5 natural elements. Ether, also known as akasha, can roughly be considered space between every living cell, according to Byerly-Croxon, space as in outer space, space as the fluid that sound, vibration, and thought waves travel through, and space as a place the spiritual or astral body inhabits, which is sometimes known as the etheric body. And the pentagram, which is a symbol that many pagans use, particularly Druids and witches, Wiccans. It's the natural elements of earth, air, fire, and water. And then the 5th point of the pentagram or 5-pointed star is ether or spirit. So this connects with ancient philosophy of the substances that compose the universe. So the absorption of Hindu concepts.
Jenny, I'm sorry to interrupt you again. I think we're not seeing your nice pictures right now because your slide is frozen, unfortunately. I'm so sorry to interrupt. There we go. Hold on.
I probably haven't changed the slide, actually.
Oh, that's fine. Oh, good. Okay. I was just checking. Okay. Sorry.
Thanks. Thanks for letting me know. So usually I have lots of pictures, but I didn't add so much here. This ether, this concept of ether, that's found in Hindu cosmology, the absorption of Hindu concepts into contemporary paganism is an indication of the hybrid or syncretic nature of this religious tradition. So similarly, this concepts taken for practices taken from different indigenous religions, from Native American practices like the burning of sage at the start of the magical ritual. So lots of pagan groups do this as well. So to purify the space or the magic circle, which I'll come back to in a moment. So so some pagans believe that magic is a force that acts within etheric space and can affect the spiritual self. So many adhere to the view that magic is a force or energy that emanates from the mind, a psychic power. And I have a quote from a Druid column. He says, people with very, very high spiritual ability can create physical things from nothing. Energy. So on that level, yes, I believe in magic, he says. I've changed the names of my research participants. So contemporary pagan conceptions of magic draw from the definition and method put forward by the ceremonial magician Aleister Crowley, as that of intensely focusing the will in order to effect change. And just to reiterate that the forms of paganism that I research, in the Irish context, I have included different forms of pagan witchcraft and druidry. So the things I'm speaking about now about magic, especially connected to Aleister Crowley, this would not be true maybe of other forms of contemporary paganism. You know, there's the Nordic traditions, for example, of Asatru and heathenism. So just I'm speaking about the types that I research. So Aleister Crowley, who you might have heard of, a famous, infamous ceremonial magician, his book Magic, with the K spelling, Magic in Theory and Practice, in 1929. In that book, he states, magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. In magical systems, the will has a specific meaning. So it's not just willpower. So Brandon Harwood says, it is a person's ability to desire, think, and act. It is a person's agency. Will is much more than a person's desire or emotions. End quote. The concept of the magical will has its origins in historical esoteric traditions, such as that, like the development of ideas around the magical will is connected to esoteric organizations and traditions like that of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So Neville Drury says, central to the development of the Golden Dawn as a magical organization would be the development of the magical will, sometimes capitalized to connote a higher spiritual purpose. End quote. So for many pagans, the concept of focusing the will relates to the idea of a macrocosm and a microcosm, as is true of many occult or and worldviews. If the individual mind is part of a larger reality composed of energies or forces, then by focusing one's willpower, desires, and thoughts, the energy emanating from the mind, one can have an effect on the external reality or wider cosmos. In pagan discourse, this is commonly expressed in the phrase, as above, so below. It is maintained that the consciousness is purposefully in tune with the workings of the universe, such that things occur in conformity with one's will. Adherence to this concept of magic often means that coincidence is re-evaluated as the significant magical occurrence, and close attention is paid to synchronicity. So in the Jungian sense, so some, I should have phrased that differently actually. So some people say that there are no coincidences. You know, they interpret events as magic happening to align things a certain way in a person's life. As Tanya Luhrmann describes in her ethnographic study, the very first study done on contemporary pagan witchcraft, persuasions of the witch's craft, ritual magic in contemporary England, she says, chance plays an ambiguous role in the magical universe. An interconnected whole leaves little space for aberration. Even stochastically inclined magicians treat simultaneity as significant and interpret apparent coincidences as causal connections. If two events coincide, it is because they are in some way related. End quote. Many pagans hold strong belief in the efficacy of magic for altering reality, and some have compared the mechanism of magic to that of prayer. Of course, people are influenced by the societies and cultures that they grow up in. So often the comparisons that my research participants would make would be to Catholic practice, for example. So some have compared the mechanism of magic to that of prayer. One of my informants says, you know, magic works. It's the same as the power of prayer. And all the power of prayer is, and all the power of magic is just the will to make something happen. So focusing the will. It is evident from the interviewees quoted that personal definitions of magic are unique, yet most seem to involve the notion of energy, whether that is a psychic energy that emits from the mind or numinous energies operating in the world that can either be attuned to or manipulated by a magical practitioner. The objective of magical practice for many is to live in accord with the natural rhythms of life, to harmonize one's own spiritual life with the cycles and changes in the external world. Others wish to direct these spiritual forces in order to achieve some end. For some practitioners, these two agendas, the interchange of adjusting the self to external life energies and acts of manipulating those outer energies, are combined in their personal practices. So just to mention, because I started off with a quote from John Block, whose book is called How Neo-Pagans and New Agers Talk About Themselves. So some academics have conflated the contemporary paganism and the New Age. I would see them as different categorizations, different types of religiosity, but there is some overlap. So often in the New Age, there's what are described as white lighters or white witches. So there's this distinction between black and white magic. In pagan worldview, magic is understood to be a neutral force, generally speaking. And so whether the outcome of a magical working is good or bad is determined by the practitioner's will or intent. Thus, the distinction between black magic and white magic is not normally found in pagan discourse, and this has been noted by various scholars. David Green says, one significant difference between pagan magic and the New Age is the pagan synthesis of both light and dark energies in its magical practices. End quote. Indeed, the only color attribution in paganism that I have come across appears to be green magic for ecological workings or earth healing, as it's known. The practitioner's objective in working magic is given much attention in pagan worldview, and there are strong magical ethics, including a karmic rule, which is particularly in Wicca, the threefold law of return. The idea that something sent out magically in a ritual can come back threefold on the practitioner. So this characteristic that magic is generally understood as a force that is part of the universe in a holistic cosmology that rests on the fundamental notion that a spiritual energy infuses all things. And this is a characteristic feature of paganism globally. Many pagans profess that each living thing possesses a particular energy vibration that is a manifestation of the universal life force, and that there are different energy fields that make up the totality of existence. For many, the spiritual force is equivalent to magic, since what is affected or changed through ritual are the energy components that are integral to the fabric of life. So others understand it differently, but the metaphor of a web is often used to communicate this concept. There is a prominent idea, as I mentioned earlier, of a microcosm and a macrocosm, or different spheres of existence, as with many esoteric worldviews, and of different levels of consciousness. So this is also something found in the New Age, the idea of different energy vibrations. So this is where New Age came from, the term, that the planet is moving into a new vibration of the dawning of a new age. So this is also found in contemporary paganism. So Lynn Hume, in her article titled "By Not of One the Spell's Begun, by Not of Two it cometh true, Magic, Altered States and Multiple Realities," she states, "The worldview conceives of a universe encompassing planes of consciousness, working independently yet as one, a vast web of interrelated activity. In this universe, the outer or physical level can affect changes on the inner or subconscious mind, which in turn can affect changes at the physical level. Thus, there is an ever-increasing spiral effect," end quote. So there's spirals are very significant. Circles and spirals are significant in pagan worldview. And the spiral is also found on many of the monuments, the sites, like Newgrange. This is a pre-Celtic symbol on the stones. And the circle, as I'll get to in a moment, is also very significant, both as a symbol and as a practical format for ritual. So the pattern of energy is variously described in pagan discourse. It can be referred to as the divine, the source, a higher power, or as energy, or spirit. So for some pagans, it is envisaged as a power emanating from a deity, which might be conceptualized as the divine feminine. So there's a lot of, in the development of the contemporary pagan movement, there's an overlap with the goddess movement and with the feminist movement. So the goddess or goddesses, the divine feminine, is central to pagan practice. So for some pagans, it's the divine feminine, but it's also the divine masculine is also important. And just to mention that my research participants are men and women, and that druids and witches can be male or female. So people tend to associate druids with men and witches with women, but this is not the case in the practice of paganism as a religious movement. Tanis Foltz and Wendy Griffin, discussing their ethnographic research on pagan goddess worship, state the goddess, which is symbolized as an autonomous female divinity, is also a metaphor for the earth, the great mother, and the interconnection between every living thing. Another end quote, another holistic aspect of paganism is the view the universe is composed of the elements, as I mentioned earlier, earth, air, fire, and water, with each with its own magical association or correspondence with some kind of otherworldly quality, or with the directions north, south, east, and west. So there's magical correspondences between things. So the four elements, the number 4 represents stability, and the universe is conceptualized as containing a fusion of all 4 elements, as I also referred to earlier, plus spirit. Ritual is believed to be effective since the energies in the world are affected by the actions. In this cosmology, everything is comprised of energy, including the land, and there is the concept of hidden relationships between different energy fields. Rituals are believed to influence the interaction of these energies, and scholars of paganism, including Graham Harvey, have described this new religious movement as animism. The earth energies in forms of Celtic paganism, including the forms that I research, the earth energies are connected with the mythological traditions, the folklore of the Aes She, or Anslua She, translated as the fairy host. So the mounds in the landscape, as being the entranceways into the other world or residences of the fairy beings. This is also connected with rituals and energies that are being connected with. So James Beckford, in his article, Holistic Imagery and Ethics in New Religious and Healing Movements, suggests that it is by means of various holistic world images that a connection is made between ethics, spirituality, and healing. Beckford states that his use of the term world image is in the sense in which Max Weber used it, that is, symbols of man's position in the world. Holistic imagery is also found in pagan healing practices, and many pagans talk about this, the connection or transference of energy from the earth to people or from people to other people. So this also, these understandings also come into the celebration of festivals as part of a cycle or wheel of the year, and many other cycles of life, like the personal life cycle, and so on. As part of this holistic cosmology, there is evidently a yearning to feel closer to the natural world by re-establishing a connection with the process of nature and natural cycles. As Susan Greenwood states in her article, The Wild Hunt, a mythological language of magic, the majority of practitioners of nature religion see the world in holistic terms, where everything is interconnected. But people living in modern societies are separated from the natural world. They are no longer directly dependent upon it for day-to-day survival. Therefore, a relationship with nature has to be created, end quote. Attuning to the rhythms of the seasonal cycle and the birth, death, rebirth cycle, as it's known, are significant in pagan worldview. Dave Green, in his article, Opposites Attract, Magical Identity and Social Uncertainty, states, pagans are rehabilitating or retraditionalizing pre-modern notions of time and rhythm in the form of seasonal celebration. They emphasize the rhythms of nature rather than the Newtonian arrow of time and Fordist rhythms of the machine, end quote. These natural cycles are sometimes represented by the holly king and the oak king of winter and summer, respectively. Symbolism of the green man, a vegetation deity, as reinterpreted in paganism, or foliage god or spirit, is used to represent new spring growth and life emerging from the darkness. The earth is revitalized and comes alive again after the death of winter. The green man figure has taken on new meanings in paganism and in pagan ritual dramas, for example, for the festivals of Imbolc, which falls on the 1st of February, the start of spring traditionally, and Bealtaine, which falls on the 1st of May, the traditional start of summer in Ireland. As Green states, the Sabbats, which is the name for the festivals in paganism, are marked by rituals in which life and death imagery and archetypes are played with, constantly being deconstructed and reassembled. Death is often ritually transformed to rebirth. This idea of rebirth is a metaphor that is common to paganism and magic and is symbolic of spiritual transformation, end quote. Some tended to be conducive to making contact with the spiritual realm or other worlds. The other world is understood in a specific way by contemporary pagans in Ireland, and traditional notions of what the other world is and how human beings can engage with it have also been reinterpreted. So it's a mixture of globalized pagan concepts. This is integrated with folklore and mythological traditions. So one of the main sources for one of the main cultural resources for pagans in Ireland is the early Irish literature or the medieval manuscripts. So it was Christian scribes who wrote down the stories and accounts of the pagan world, but also Christianized them to some extent, changing some of the stories and so on. But this is still, the source that we have for Irish mythology, and the place names and sites, some sites that are mentioned in those manuscripts. That's very significant for contemporary pagans. Susan Greenwood, in her book Magic, Witchcraft and the Other World, an Anthropology, explains that there are diverse groups that go under the broad term of paganism, and asserts that, quote, these disparate groups have varying mythologies and cosmologies, but all share a common uniting belief in communication with an other world, a realm of deities, spirits, or other beings experienced in an alternative state of consciousness. The other world is viewed as part of a holistic totality, coexistent with ordinary, everyday reality. It is seen to be a source of sacred power. Contact and communication with the other world is usually conducted through special rituals, a process that is seen to bring transformations both to the individual and to the wider cosmos. Connections with the other world is thus central to the magical practice and experience of paganism, end quote. Many pagans maintain that the other world exists alongside the material world, and that casting a magic circle or sacred circle is one way of entering this realm. The notion here is that practitioners in an altered state of consciousness can focus more readily on the magical work at hand and commune with entities in the spiritual realm. Ritual, then, is the method of altering consciousness. As Lynn Hume states, the quintessence of pagan rituals is to gain access to an alternate reality and to induce and highlight the experience, variously termed ecstatic, mystical, or numinous. I'll just skip through a little bit so that I don't go over time. So the magic circle, I mentioned that there's a basic structure for pagan ritual that I found that witches, including Wiccans and Druids, they cast a circle. So casting a circle is a technical term. So it's either visualizing a circle, marking it out on the ground, or going to a stone circle. So the stone circle is regarded by many pagans as an already existing magical circle out on the landscape, and it's associated with ancestral pagan practices. So there were different systems of ritual magic, but generally in paganism, methods of working magic, as I mentioned earlier, it's quite free form and it's left to the individual practitioner to develop as part of their spiritual growth and their personal mastering of the magical arts. Ritual is means by which magic is produced, it is believed, and the primary method of communing with spiritual forces. As Dave Green explains in his article, Wishful Thinking, Notes Towards a Psychoanalytic Sociology of Pagan Magic, ritual, whether collective or individual, ceremonial or instinctual, arguably forms the main avenue of spiritual transformation within pagan magic. Importantly, rituals mediate between the ritual actors and the forces with which they wish to commune and connect. So megalithic sites are in different Celtic regions, in different and I'll get to the Celticization of these sites in a second, but this isn't unique to Ireland. These megalithic sites in particular are very significant symbols in pagan practice and in artwork and discourse generally. So there's different understandings of the magic circle. Some say that it's a globe, like that holds the magical energy that's raised. Others talk about the circle as a space that has been purified and keeps malevolent forces out, or to keep a protected space so that other magical practitioners cannot interfere with the ritual. So there's many reasons for the circle. So the circle is cast normally starting in the eastern quarter by moving diosal or clockwise. So once the circle is cast, there is the calling of the quarters. So this is common in Wicca, where each cardinal direction or compass point is opened. Each quarter has a particular magical association or element. And as Vivian Crowley states, the different elements represent energy in different states. So north is earth, south is fire, east is air, and west is water. Each quarter has an associated magical entity in Wicca called an elemental, sometimes called a watchtower or guardian, since they are thought to watch over the ritual. The elementals are believed to bring particular energies into the magical working. And I have found that both Wiccans and Druids, well, other pagan witches as well, the spirits of place are often, or the genie loci, this is often conflated with the she. So she has been translated into English as fairies, which is problematic, but it has these three interconnected meanings in Old Irish. She or sheath means the fairy beings themselves, these mounds, like the mound at Tara that I showed a while ago, and the peaceful quality of life in the other world. So we still have this meaning in modern Irish. So an Garda Síochána, guardians of the peace, for the police force. So these are interconnected in the mythological tradition. The fairy beings residing in the mounds, or the mounds being a portal or entranceway into the other world, and it having a harmonious way of life there. Tír na nÓg, which is a name for the other world, land of youth, is described as a bright paradise with where there's no sickness or old age. So just to skip on a bit to the I'll just skip through some of this onto megalithic sites. So megalithic monuments are highly important as both symbols and ritual sites for contemporary pagans. there is a modern re-engagement with the Neolithic sites, which draw on legends and popular associations. So the significance of megalithic sites in contemporary paganism has been influenced by lots of different intellectual and artistic movements, different romantic movements through time, as well as folklore, legends connected to these sites. For modern pagans, these sites feature prominently in their meaning system and practices. Catherine Rowntree discusses the different interpretive frameworks and concerns of the scientific discipline of archaeology and that of pagan practitioners in her article, Holy Sites, Archaeological Monuments, and the Perennial Contest over Material Heritage. And she states, debates between pagans and archaeologists center on these sites called archaeological sites by archaeologists and sacred or holy sites by pagans. Even such appellations make clear the different discursive framing used by the two groups, end quote. Locations deemed to be sacred sites by Ireland's witches and druids include megalithic structures like stone circles, as I mentioned, standing stones, dolmens. Indeed, these sites are hyper-symbolic, associated with ancestral peoples, Celtic spirituality, mythic narratives and local stories, as well as contemporary ritual practices and the energies said to be felt at these places, as I mentioned earlier. These practices themselves are sometimes described by pagans as Celtic ritual or as part of a Celtic spiritual practice. The notion of Celtic spirituality has been developed within a particular context. And of course, these sites in archaeology, in the archaeological study of them, they're not Celtic, they're pre-Celtic. So it's quite problematic when you get to identity as Celtic pagans. So the peak of the Romantic era in the 19th century, and images and symbols, including this association between Celts and megalithic monuments, and specifically Druids, with these sites, still finds resonance today in various new religious movements and has merged with other popular conceptions of the Celtic to be found in areas of popular culture, including fantasy art and comic books, and also Celtic Christianity. The 18th century English antiquarian William Stukeley, along with many of his contemporaries, held that the Druids, Celtic priests active in Britain and France during the Iron Age, built Stonehenge and practiced rituals at megalithic sites. The 18th and 19th century Celtic revival movements placed most emphasis on the languages, landscapes, and lifeways of the so-called peasantry as being Celtic infused as part of the association of language with place, and place, as pointed out by Diarmaid O'Dulone, when he notes that, quote, with Romanticism, the ancient Celts were idealized, as were the landscapes inhabited by the modern speakers of Celtic languages, end quote. The Romantic era notion of language containing some kind of spiritual essence also influences modern paganism. Using the Irish language rather than English is believed to help people connect spiritually to place, and there exists an emphasis on place names associated with Druidic practices or the deities of the pagan religion. So, you've probably seen these images of Stonehenge, especially with there's the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, and the British Druid Order. And this idea of sensing energy from stones, I've come across this a lot in my research. This is an image of a Druid in the Midlands. He's sensing energy from the stone. So he's one of the owl grove of Druids. So I'm using that. That's a photo I used with permission in a publication. So just to sum up, these different romantic revivals, including the Irish literary revival, where you had a connection between ordinary Irish people and the Celtic world by members of that artistic movement, particularly William Butler Yeats, whose book titled The Celtic Twilight came to be used for that movement itself, this kind of artistic renaissance. So holistic worldview and magical practices of contemporary pagans in the Irish context are embedded in a fabric of meaning, which includes specific notions of Celticity. Pagan witches and druids place emphasis on idealized images of a past, the world of the Celts, and mix these with symbols from an agrarian, pre-modern world. To connect with nature, the land becomes important, as does the built heritage, the material culture, called by pagans sacred sites, which also lends further symbolic significance and associations of spiritual lineages, that ancestral peoples, whoever they were, pre-Celtic, Celtic, that they built these structures, the idea that they practice ritual at these megalithic monuments. Thus, magic and megaliths are intricately connected in contemporary pagan worldview and practice. Apologies for going over time. Just stop sharing my screen.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Butler, for that fascinating talk. Really, really fantastic. So as usual, if anyone has any questions, please do type them into the chat or the Q&A, and I'll read them out. I'll keep an eye on those to see if any questions appear. But I'm also going to exercise, I can't see any immediately. It might take a minute for them to come through. I'm going to exercise my privilege as chair to ask a few questions. I have about 100 written down. so mostly just for extra information and for different ways of, so in a very broad sense, I'm interested, and one of the reasons I was delighted to have you as a speaker is that it's natural enough when, with centers like the Newman Center to focus on the Abrahamic religions kind of unthinkingly, and not to properly consider different kinds of religious practice in a much broader sense and in the sense that you've been researching. And a very broad question that occurred to me was, what do you think the study of paganism, your study of paganism, what can that teach us or tell us about or help us to do in terms of the sort of study of religions in general? What lessons can we learn? How should we perhaps reconceive the way we approach religion in general? I was wondering if you had anything to say on that dimension.
Well, there's lots of things I can think of in answer to that. I didn't have my laptop plugged in. I think, well, as a scholar who does ethnographic research, I'm very interested in people's lived experience. So people's reality, like what does their religious spiritual life mean to them in an everyday kind of sense, rather than studying a text. So it's quite interesting, I think, with contemporary paganism, that there is no text, there is no doctrine. So this complicates the definition of religion that we have from some academic schools of thought, particularly coming from a theological or there are lots of different definitions of religion, but people tend to think of, as you said, the Abrahamic faiths. So I think it's one of the reasons why it's important is to understand cultural movements, because culture and religion are always intertwined. And that's one thing that looking at a new religious movement as it's lived, as in contemporary times, it's always part of society as it is now. And it helps us understand other things about the world we live in. So that's one thing. And I, in everything that I research, contemporary paganism and also folk religion, aspects of popular religion, I find these are on the margins of academic research, and that has also to do with both definitions of what religion is, that are quite well established in academia, but also with the hegemony of Abrahamic religions in the world. So again, that comes back to cultural context, because academia is also part of a cultural context. So I think integrating that, animistic or magical religions, or also indigenous religions into the category of religion, I think that's important, rather than it being, the Abrahamic traditions and then everything else kind of on the periphery. So I think there's a number of reasons why it's important to critically analyze these things.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, and it helps me as in thinking about the center going forward. I think this is your talk in particular on this topic has been, might make a big difference to how I proceed in just. I have a question from Maria Bergramian, a professor in the School of Philosophy with me. How prevalent in Ireland are these magical or pagan practices? So can you give us a sense of the prevalence? That's very interesting. I tend to associate them with Wales for some reason. I'm aware a little bit of Welsh, as it were, Welsh paganism or Druidic practice, but Irish paganism or Druidic practice or animism, it's not something I've been made too aware of. So is it prevalent? Is it?
I can never give a precise answer because I do qualitative research. So it's quite difficult for a number of reasons to say how many pagans there are in Ireland, or how prevalent the practices are. So as Helen Berger, a pagan studies scholar, Professor Helen Berger talks about how pagan scholars often, who do ethnographic research, often overestimate the amount of practitioners, because we're constantly interacting with the community. So it's one of the reasons why it's difficult to know is the census in Ireland doesn't record the number of pagans. It's not there as a category. And there's also a number of reasons why pagans may not fill out a census, to self-identify as pagans, because many people feel that religion should be private. They don't want to be counted. Many people don't want the pagan traditions to be institutionalized as well. So there's a number of dynamics going on. But if they do fill in pagan on the census, it's counted in other. So it's not broken down. But it's estimated based on the census in Britain. For Scotland has counted pagans. It's estimated that in Ireland it would be similar to the Hindu community in Ireland, so not that big. It's a marginalized marginal tradition, and so there isn't really data precisely, but it's in the thousands. So in terms of prevalence, if we interpret that as visibility, I think since I began my field work. I started in 2001 for my PhD, and I've continued with like different projects since then. I found the public profile of paganism has increased significantly, especially since the Hill of Tara, the M3 motorway. This campaign was pagan led, and at least in relation to direct action on the hill itself. So there was some media coverage of that. Whereas when I started, I found that a lot of people didn't know what paganism was. They thought it was something, you know, that there were atheists or Satanists or something. And so this, like I found that people now, generally speaking, they know that paganism is a religion, that it's a new religious movement, and also the festival celebrations like the Hill of Ishnok at Bealtaine. You know, this has been revived as the lighting of the fires on that hill. Our president, Michael D. Higgins, lit the fires, I think it was in 2009. So there was also quite a lot of media coverage and explanations of what paganism is. So the prevalence, or at least the visibility, is, you know, it's increasing. So I can only kind of speak anecdotally. So I can see Maeve's comment and question there. Indigenous thinking is sometimes seen as an important resource in the present context of ecological disaster for responding to the need to fundamentally change human relations to the natural world, also to material objects. Do you see magic as a similar resource? So I found that in contemporary pagan practice, there is a lot of overlap between environmental activism. So many people that I have interviewed are involved in, you know, environmental activism, like protecting what they regard as sacred sites, or particular trees or forests, or you know, it also extends to things like recycling and so on. So pagans, generally speaking, regard themselves as guardians of the earth, and this is an important part of their spiritual practice. Well, for a lot of people. So I mentioned the practice of green magic or earth healing. So I've interviewed people about rituals to heal the planet and to heal animals, and to tie up or reconnect ley lines, so energy currents under the ground, that are understood to be broken by the building of roads or other structures. So it is an important aspect of contemporary paganism.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to Maeve and Maria for the questions. Oh, I think we have another one actually. Yeah, Sinead Mercier. I'd love to hear a few words on your new project on fairy lore with regards to landscape. Thank you, Sinead.
Yes, so I have, I suppose, two different projects. One, I look at how contemporary pagans conceptualize fairy beings and the other world, and how they connect with, how they engage with traditions, like historical practices in Ireland, and how they also give new meanings to fairy lore. But I also have a separate project where I look at fairy lore and landscapes as part of folk religion that has been understudied in the Irish context. You know, it has been approached, fairy lore, generally speaking, has been approached as, in the discipline of folklore, especially, as a form of entertainment, or there's a lot of focus on the legends as narrative traditions, but not so much on people's lived experience to do with landscape. So I'm quite interested in what that means today. So how these traditions, like what kind of attitudes there are to fairy lore, how legends are connected to landscapes, including these megalithic sites. And I've done some research in Ireland, but also in Newfoundland in Canada. So I was interested in how these traditions changed in a different landscape when the Irish emigrated there, and how this manifests today. And also in Iceland, where I interviewed people and visited sites associated with the elves and Huldafolk, or hidden people. So I'm interested in this as an aspect of intangible cultural heritage that has been shaped by different processes, in how people engage with it, or what the attitudes are in different countries. So Sinead, if you want me to answer something more specific than that, I can.
Thank you, Sinead. I'll see if another comment comes through. I have another question, if you don't mind, if that's okay. I have many more, but just another that occurs to me and that I was interested in hearing what you thought about. So one slight concern I had in thinking about paganism, as you've set it out, is that, is there a risk that there's a sort of, and in prioritizing response, a connection with the landscape, and you mentioned sort of ancestral connections in the past, at some points as well. Is there a connection with a sort of, does one have to be from a certain kind of ethnicity to, as it were, does an Irish pagan have to be Irish? And is there a kind of a slight danger of a kind of, that the practice gets wrapped up in a kind of nationalist kind of, where it's a kind of quite exclusive in that, can it become quite exclusive in that respect? This occurred to me because I was thinking of a previous conversation I'd once had with a Hindu who said, I mentioned that the head of a Hindu research center in Oxford was an Irishman, which he was by birth. And he said, well, look, he can't be a Hindu because he's not, he's just simply the wrong ethnicity. There's just no way. And we had a sort of back and forth about that. Is there a danger with that? Is there an element of that? I'm wondering what you discovered in your research along those lines, if anything.
Well, I have found, I can speak generally about, the characteristic features of paganism in Ireland. And I found that this, the general development of paganism in Ireland has been very influenced by romantic and cultural nationalism. So it's different from other parts of Europe. So, for example, Eastern and Central European pagan traditions can be more exclusionary, or based on, you have to be an ethnic Lithuanian, for example, you have to speak Lithuanian. I'm just using that as an example. There's many other countries and regions I could choose, but in Ireland, I found, in my research, I haven't come across this kind of militant or exclusionary aspect. That's not to say it's not there, but that there's not, ethno-nationalist groups of pagans in Ireland. But I haven't come across them in my field work. So generally, I find that the prevailing view is that people can attune or connect with the land of Ireland. So there is some emphasis placed on Celticity. So people coming, you mentioned Wales. I have interviewed people from Wales or parts of Britain who feel they have a Celtic identity, and that they can connect spiritually maybe more easily with Ireland, because they have some Celtic ancestry. But I've also interviewed people from, Poland and different Slavic regions, from Germanic cultures, that have moved to Ireland and joined pagan groups, and they talk about, you know, how the energies of the land are different, but they have been able to join groups and to practice rituals. So there doesn't seem to be barriers to that, which suggests that it's not an ethno-nationalist situation generally. But I also mentioned the Irish language, and I have found that, you know, there's a very complex relationship with the Irish language in Ireland anyway. So I found that people who have moved to Ireland, but also Irish people who don't speak Irish, some people have learned some Irish or Old Irish phrases or words for use in ritual because they understand it as the language of the land. So it seems to be more a tool for engaging that has kind of come out of quite romanticized movements, you know, this connection between land and language and ancestry, which can also, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, be quite dangerous and excluding people. But I found that it's the opposite really in the Irish pagan community in a general sense. So I can only speak about characteristic features that I have come across in my research. So as I said, you know, maybe there are groups that are with a very different perspective, but I haven't come across that.
Oh, thanks, Jenny. Yeah, that's promising about Irish paganism. That's nice. I had one final question. Oh no, wait, now I've got another one in the Q&A. Good. Sinead says, ethno-nationalism, Pagan Federation Ireland responded quite strongly to a US Odinist. Oh, there we go. That's the kind of thing I was thinking of. Seeking a particular approach. We would prefer to find someone who only performs sexual ceremonies and refrains. So there was a kickback against the, that's interesting. That speaks to your your hypothesis about Irish paganism. So my final question was just concerning Irish religion in general. So do you detect, and this again is quite broad, so you know, it may be a bit too broad in some ways, but do you think there are ways in which pre-Christian religion in Ireland has found its way into mainstream Irish religion? And do you have any sense of, you know, you mentioned interestingly that Irish pagans make that connection with Roman Catholic practice very naturally. Do you think that there's any more sort of sources of connection or leakage or relationship between the two? I think that would be, I'm thinking particularly of holy wells, of statues, and you probably have something to say about that.
Yeah, well, I find because of the history of you know, pre-Christian paganism with small p, if you like, the way it merged together, the early Christian, in early Christianity, you had a merging, so they say, with the nature religion that existed, or however we want to describe it, of Celtic peoples who likely absorbed pre-Celtic influences. So by the time we get to the Roman Catholic, the medieval times onward, it's you already have this syncretic kind of this mixture. So for like we can see this, you know, in Ireland, the folk religion or popular religion is folk Catholicism or popular Catholicism. So the kind of flavor of Catholicism in Ireland is very connected to the landscape, you know, with pilgrimage traditions to like Croagh Patrick in Mountain in County Mayo. It's thought that the mountain has pre-Christian, you know, there's all of these fertility associations and so on. So you mentioned holy wells. So there's many, there's, you know, it's quite a good example of that kind of mixture of pagan and Christian. And we have Saint Bridget being a Christianized goddess. So for you, that's already there in the popular practices and how that's overlaid on the landscape. So for contemporary pagans, who most people I've interviewed who would have grown up in Ireland are from Catholic backgrounds, so they tend to kind of strip away what they regard as the Christian parts and keep what they regard as the pagan parts. So one example of that is circling, or the circumambulation of the Holy Well or other sites. Professor Pruntius McKenna has, in his book, The Cult of the Sacred Center, he has talked about this ritual action as an ancient ritual movement in both Ireland and India. And I mentioned the pagan term diosel, and this comes from the Irish language deshel, and going around a sacred site sunwise or clockwise. The word in Irish deshel has an association not just of the movement to the right hand side, but also something that's good or correct, or it has an association with positivity, and in popular magical practices, it's for some good outcome, whereas a curse would be the opposite direction. So that's been absorbed into paganism, but globally. American pagans would also use this term diosel. So it's quite interesting how the different kind of layers of religiosity connect up with each other.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Butler. So I think we don't have any further questions in the comments, so I think I'll call it to a close now. And thank you so much for speaking to us, and for your fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Thank you from Amy in the comments, and also and a comment from Janice as well, thanking you and saying she's going to her interest has been well and truly sparked, as has mine. Yeah, thank you very much, and hopefully see you again sometime. Thank you for the talk.
Hope so. Thank you.
Take care.